Vinay, what do you think is the role of the intellectual in the 21st century?
Well, if I had to encapsulate it in, let's say, a few sentences, I think that besides furnishing a kind of critical edge to the paradigms of knowledge that we already have, I think the intellectual has an ethical responsibility to question first the state. I think that one should always be suspicious of the state. I don't believe that there is such a thing as a benevolent state myself. And I also think that the kind of oppositions that we have today are not particularly productive in questioning the state. When I say oppositions, I mean, for example, state versus civil society. I mean, if you look at a country such as Bangladesh or Nepal, the civil society component, and the largest portion of that is the NGOs, they have become the state, effectively. I mean, even a country such as India has 4 million NGOs, but in India, they don't exercise the kind of influence that they do in countries such as Bangladesh and Nepal, and one can summon many other instances. So in critiquing the state, one has to be quite certain that one doesn't simply fall back into the distinction between state and civil society, which is, in my view, what most people do. Right? So first, as I said, to reiterate, I think the intellectual should question the state. The intellectual should furnish a very critical edge to the paradigms of knowledge that exist. Thirdly, I think, as I tried to suggest in my remarks this morning, that I think the entire edifice of modern knowledge is something that has to be seriously taken into consideration. And when we take that into consideration, it means that we have to look at the place and production of knowledge in relationship to larger questions of the global political economy. What are the kinds of flows that take place? Have modern political arrangements facilitated greater exchanges which are also equitable at the same time? And the answer, in my view, would be no, they haven't. Right? So those would be some of the things that I think that the intellectual has to be engaged in. I mean, you can use other kinds of frameworks. I mean, if you use a framework that Edward Said had furnished, then the task of the intellectual is to engage in a kind of critical humanism, as he had put it. But then we would have to question the whole genealogy of humanism, right? Well, whose humanism are we talking about? What are the principles from which this humanism is derived? So forth and so on. So I would prefer not to use a language of that kind. Yeah.
Well, what do you think is the value of critical thinking? Actually, what would you define critical thinking as?
Oh well, that's a very large question, as you know. I mean, you know, it's a question with enormous philosophical layers.
In a nutshell.
But well, in a nutshell, no. Critical thinking, in the first instance, means a certain form of self-reflexivity. Now, I think that that's extraordinarily important to the development of the self and to the development of culture. And I'll take the liberty of giving you a little folk tale from India, okay, which is a very good way of entering the question of self-reflexivity. There's an Indian epic that at least people who read world literature would be familiar with, the Ramayana. And very often people argue that the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the other great epic, there is actually a South Indian epic as well, but these two are the pan-Indian epics, so to speak, that they occupy the same place in Indian culture that the Iliad and the Odyssey do in the West. It's an entirely mistaken comparison, because the Iliad and the Odyssey are not living texts. They haven't been living texts for a very long period of time. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata are deeply woven into every fabric of, every corner of Indian society, down to the present day. Now, in the Ramayana, in a nutshell, the story is woven around the character of Ram, who is a king, and he is ordered by his father, for reasons that we need not get into at the present moment, to go into exile into the forest for 14 years. and as the dutiful, obedient son of his father, he says, I shall follow your command. Now, Ram is married to a woman who also comes from a princely aristocratic family. Her name is Sita. And Ram tells Sita, my father has ordered me to go into exile for 14 years. You, however, shall not accompany me. And there's a dispute that takes place between them because she says, I'm going to accompany you to the forest. And he says, you can't because you come from a princely aristocratic family. You have no idea how hazardous a life it is in the forest. You're going to be sleeping on a rough, floor. You won't have servants to attend to your needs. They're wild animals, so forth and so on. And then she says, well, the Hindu scriptures say that the place of a wife is by her husband. Okay, and then Ram says, but the Hindu scriptures also say that the word of the husband is a command to you. And then she says, but the Hindu scriptures also say that if someone or some text says something and it rebels against your conscience, you must not follow it. So back and forth goes this debate. Eventually, the decision is that she will accompany him to the forest. Right? Now, the great Indian writer Anantamurthy once told me a Kannada folk version of this. Okay? In the folk version, they have the same debate as they do in the Sanskritic version. Right? They have the same debate. It goes back and forth, a very intricate debate. And then finally, Sita clinches the whole thing by saying, in all other versions of the Ramayana, this debate took place and I ended up accompanying you. Okay? In all other versions of the Ramayana, this is a folk version, by the way. Okay? This is what I mean by self-reflexivity. Right? So I think the first component of critical thought is, in fact, actually self-reflexivity. Right? Now one could add a great many elements to what it means to engage in critical thought. And then it would mean, well, what kind of engagement one has with society, with community, with the world at large. Is the task of the person who is engaging in critical thought to be contrarian, for example? But, contrarian is a little bit too easy because people might be contrarian simply because they want to be irksome to others, They want to be the gadfly, so to speak, right? But some element of that must be there, certainly, right? And so on. But I think that this is how I would attempt to answer the question.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. Cool.